Welcome back, guys. We're breaking down UFC Fight Night, Kattar versus Allen, and apparently we only have 9 fights for this card. A number of fights getting canceled here, a number of pullouts, and it looks like a few fights did get moved also. Regardless, we still have the main event intact. So without further ado, let's just dive right into the breakdowns. Hawes is the minus 170 favorite. Dolidze's the plus 145 underdog, and we'll start with Dolidze first. So Dolidze, honestly, someone I'm still not very sold on. I will admit, he is a pretty dangerous fighter. He's a capable finisher, whether it's on the feet or on the mat. But the issue with Dolidze is his minute winning ability is just absolutely horrendous. Outside of him landing a couple of knees to the face, he hasn't really looked all that good, if I'm being honest. He's very low volume on the feet. He's reliant on, just big moments. His fight IQ is a little questionable also. But overall, I'd just say that outside of him finding a finish, he just hasn't really looked great whatsoever. He's kind of just been relegated to having to wall install opponents to win fights. And it's not even over particularly good opponents either, right? He's looked pretty mediocre against pretty low-level guys like John Alon and Trevin Giles, who he actually lost to. Was in a very sloppy, low-paced fight against Laureano Staropoli. So, Dolidze, he's going in there. He's putting on very, unspectacular performances against very unspectacular guys. And on the other side, we have Phil Hawes, who I actually think is a pretty good fighter, right? A guy who's quite well-rounded. On the feet, he's got good boxing. I do think he's a knockout threat there as well. So he's got power on the feet. He was doing some pretty good work against Curtis early in the first round before he got knocked out. And of course, he was putting on an absolute clinic against a round win. So the guy's got hands. And on top of that, he's a pretty good wrestler as well. He's very strong, very physical. The guy's a great athlete. But of course, the big issue we have with Hawes is we just can't trust his chin. Hawes, definitely one of these guys who's liable to just get dropped and knocked out at any point. Obviously, there was the Curtis fight where he was looking amazing in that first round. He was lighting Curtis up, but all it took was one shot to get through it, and it was enough to floor Hawes. And it wasn't even a particularly hard shot, in my opinion. But I will say this, though. Hawes has shown, decent recoverability. Because outside of that knockout and then the one where he got head kicked, he's actually been able to recover, fall back to his wrestling and kind of stall fights out. But, just getting dropped like that, even if you don't get finished, is very bad optics. It does kind of put you out of it too. You're going to have to kind of fight back from it, if you do get knocked down early in a fight. So a little concerning there, but I do think that between the two, Hawes is going to be the way more well-rounded fighter. And what I do like about him in this matchup is I think he's going to be the one that's dictating where the fight goes. If he wants to keep this fight standing, I think he can. I think if he wants to take the fight to the ground, I think that's going to be on Hawes too. The cardio, I think, might be a bit of a wash between the two. I know Hawes hasn't shown the best cardio, but I actually don't think it's horrendous either. We did see him slow down in a number of fights that have gone the distance, but at the end of the day, he was able to win those fights. He was able to hang on after, banking a couple of rounds. And it's over pretty respectable guys too, right? Guys like Imavov and Daukaus. So, not complete bums he's going the distance with. Whereas with Dolidze, he's in very low-paced, low-volume, just sloppy back and forth, grapply sort of affairs with guys like Staropoli and Giles and John Alon's. Just not the same caliber opponent, in my opinion. Obviously, I think that Dolidze is maybe a little live for a knockout. The guy is pretty dynamic on the feet, and Hawes does have a paper chin. So if Dolidze is able to connect with something, he could definitely put Hawes out. He could submit Hawes also, right? Dolidze, a very proficient grappler. He does like to, roll for those heel hooks and such, which, could catch Hawes off guard, especially since we don't really know how good the submission defense of Hawes really is, especially when it comes to the leg locks. But I do think that overall Dolidze's win equity is going to be tied up in, him catching Hawes with something on the feet or maybe with a sneaky submission. But I do think that Hawes should win this fight. I think he's the better fighter. I think he's the better athlete. I think he's better on the feet. He's the better wrestler. I don't think that Dolidze is going to be able to wall install him like he did with some of his previous opponents. Dolidze is definitely not going to be able to bully Hawes in the clinch. He's not going to be able to control him as easily as some of his previous opponents. I just see Hawes being able to control a lot of these exchanges, and outside of Hawes just getting caught with something on the feet, which is very live to happen, I don't see too many paths for Dolidze here. So I gotta go with Hawes. I think he probably gets it done by decision. Just keep it standing. Keep it clean. Stay defensive. Try not to get hit too much, and just likely outstrike Dolidze, who I think is a slightly inferior striker. Maybe mix in some of the wrestling as well if things get a little hairy, if it looks like, the fight's getting a little out of hand. And I do think that Hawes, if he's able to take Dolidze down, he can have some success, racking up some control time too. So I think Hawes gets it done. I think he gets it done by decision. Wouldn't be completely surprised with a knockout either. I do think that Hawes has got some power standing, but Dolidze hasn't really shown too many chin issues. But at the same time, he hasn't really fought someone with I guess the striking and the power that Hawes bring to the table just yet. So official pick, I'll go with Hawes. I'll go with Hawes to win by decision. And in the next fight, we have Joseph Holmes versus Jun-Young Park. And Park is the minus 235 favorite. Holmes is the plus 200 underdog. And we'll start with Park first. Decent sized favorite here. Rightfully so, in my opinion. Park, just a very solid, well-rounded mixed martial artist. Very technical in all aspects. The striking is quite good from him. He moves well in there. He's got a nice intercepting jab. Good leg kicks, just very technical on the feet. He can wrestle. The jiu-jitsu seems solid. I mean, I don't think he's some prolific submission grappler or anything, but he does seem quite well-versed on the mat. Didn't seem completely lost against guys like, G-Rod and Hernandez, who I think are pretty good grapplers. But it is worth noting that he did get finished in both of those fights, which, despite his nickname, Park definitely can get broken in there. Granted, it's against pretty high-level guys, and Park actually does have a loss to Shavkat back in the day, too. So Park, he's been in there with some pretty legit killers, too, and I do feel like his wins are rather respectable as well. So overall, I do think he's a solid fighter, just a bit undersized for the division, which I think could be a factor here, right? Because Holmes, he is a very tall, lanky guy for the division. Not the most physically imposing guy in there, but he does do a decent job of fighting long. He does pump the jab out. He will look to slam those body and head kicks. But overall, I do find his striking a little limited. But Holmes, he is, I think, a decent grappler too, though. I feel like that's actually where his base is. It does seem like he's more comfortable on the mat. But overall, still much more unproven on the Holmes side. I do feel he's a decent fighter, though. I feel like he's got a decent skill set. I just don't think we've seen enough from him yet, though. Because, he did come in short notice against Pickett. Didn't look great, but, he did win that first round when he was fresh. But he just didn't really have much in the tank. He probably was just not really in good fight shape. And, Holmes isn't exactly the most athletic guy in there either, in my opinion. So, he had a tough fight on short notice, but I feel like in a full camp, he could probably beat Pickett if they run it back. That said, though, it's still a lot we don't know about Holmes, but from what we have seen, I do think he's moderately well-rounded. He fights to his strength pretty well most of the time. But overall, I still have to favor Park in most aspects. Park, in my opinion, is the more well-rounded fighter. We've seen him be very comfortable on the feet, be very comfortable on the mat. I think he's the more technical striker. Obviously, he's got way more UFC experience. And even in terms of just regional experience, I kind of have to favor Park in that regards too. But the size is it's really getting to me here. 6 inches of height, 7 inches of reach, I think is pretty significant to the point where I feel like it could be enough to overcome some of the deficits in terms of the skills and the experience. Because the way Park kind of likes to fight is, he's going to look to just touch and pick at you at distance, kind of just look to outpoint you there, and then be able to mix in some of the wrestling to to kind of put a stamp on rounds and win minutes that way. But I feel like he'll have a harder time than usual getting off on his style than some of his previous opponents. Against a much bigger and longer guy in Holmes, he'll probably have a harder time, touching Holmes without getting tagged himself. And Park, in my opinion, is someone who does his best when he's able to mix in the wrestling and the grappling. Like I was saying before, I don't think he's some prolific wrestler or grappler or anything, but I do think he's a well-rounded enough mixed martial artist that he can take advantage of guys who are a little deficient there. Guys like, I would say Marc-Andre Barrio, even, definitely John Phillips, and even guys like Tefan Nchukwi, who are still a little green, at least a little green at the time. And Holmes, in my opinion, is a better grappler than these guys I just listed here. And so while I feel that Park is maybe technically the better fighter, he's got more experience in there, but I just think that Park might struggle a little more getting off his game, fighting the fight he wants against Holmes than he has against some of his other opponents at the UFC level. So I think I'm still going to pick Park to win here, but I wouldn't write Holmes off here. I know people probably aren't that high on Holmes, and I'm not myself, but I do think that stylistically, Holmes can probably put up a good fight here. I think he could definitely give Park a run for his money. So the pick is Park. I think he gets it done by decision, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if Holmes pulled off the upset here. But official pick, I'm going to stick with Park. Park via decision. And next up, we have Chase Hooper versus Steve Garcia, and Hooper's the minus 210 favorite. Garcia's the plus 180 underdog, and we'll start with Garcia first, who, honestly, I just am not quite sure what to think about this guy just yet. He's kind of had a career that's been all over the place. He's got some power in his hands. He can wrestle a bit, but it seems like most of his success is from being a weight bully at 135, where he's routinely missed weight. He's massively oversized there, and he's kind of able to just bully guys there. He makes the jump to 155 and it gets roughed up a bit there, gets his chin completely exposed, and now is settling at 145, where I feel like he should have gone this whole time, but I think it might just be a little too late at this point. And he's going up against Hooper, who is, I feel, still a bit of a developmental project at this stage in his career, because Hooper, he is a very slick, very tricky grappler, someone who is, very slippery on the mat. He'll look to just snatch anything up and kind of just work from there. He can push an insane grappling pace, but despite how good he is and how slick he is on the mat, the issue is really just getting the fight there. The wrestling is pretty bad from Hooper. Honestly, I feel like he might just be a little slow on the feet. He's shooting out from a little too far out. They're a little telegraphed. He's diving for ankles. Sometimes he's even pulling guard in there. And the striking isn't really good enough to set him up there either, right? And I do just feel like it just comes down to him being maybe just a tad slow, right? The reload time is a little slow. Opponents are able to read when a lot of the shots and strikes are coming. He does have some nice kicks, but I do feel that he's going to be at a decent disadvantage most of the time on the feet. That said, Hooper does do a decent job of, getting the fight to the mat. However, he needs to. He is very tough. He's very gritty, and he will look to push the grappling even if he's not having a ton of wrestling success, even if he's getting pieced up on the feet. So, the guy is a dog. He will go for it in there, and he's not going to give up. And I do feel that if he is able to get this fight to the ground, Hooper should have a decent amount of success there. I think there should be a big enough gap on the mat that, he'll be able to either find the submission or maybe even, rack up enough control time to win the fight that way. But taking a look at this matchup, it's kind of a tough one because, this is a matchup where, you have two guys that I am actually looking to fade. With Hooper, I do think he's got an edge in the grappling, but I don't know if he's going to have a ton of success taking Garcia down. Garcia, I do think, is going to have some size in this fight. I do think he's going to be able to match the physicality here, because Hooper, in my opinion, still is lacking a bit of that man strength. I feel like maybe a few more years of just strength and conditioning, he might be able to have an easier time just manhandling lower level fighters. But As it stands now, it does look like he still struggles a bit taking guys down and controlling them. And if he isn't able to take Garcia down in this fight, I feel like Hooper could be in a bit of trouble. He's just way too slow and hittable standing, in my opinion. But on the other side of things, we have Garcia, who I quite frankly just can't really trust at this point in his career. For one, it seems like he hasn't really settled into a weight class yet. There seems to be some uncertainty around his, fighting career. He's routinely missed weight, just very unprofessional in that regard. And in the octagon, he puts himself into very compromising situations. He's not a very high IQ fighter, in my opinion. And on top of that, we have seen some deficiencies in his grappling. He did get backpacked by Luis Pena for, I think, a good 14 minutes of that fight. It is worth noting, though, that fight was on short notice. He probably didn't have any sort of preparation, probably didn't know what Pena was going to do in that fight, and basically just gave up, 14 minutes of back control time. I do expect him to, come into this fight a little more prepared. He's probably going to be drilling his takedown defense and get-ups, but, just that performance itself is enough to make me really hesitant to take the Garcia side here, because he is going up against a pretty good ground player in Hooper, who is pretty persistent with getting the fight there. And so just for those reasons, I got to side with Hooper here. Obviously, I definitely don't trust Hooper at minus 200. He's dropped the ball before, but I do think that this is a somewhat favorable matchup, just given the tape we've seen. I feel like there is a clear path in the grappling for Hooper. I don't know how the cardio of Garcia is going to hold up later in the fight as well, especially if Hooper's, pushing that grappling pace on him. So yeah, I got to go with Hooper. I think he's going to be able to somehow get the fights to the ground here. He's probably going to have to take some damage early, but I do think he's eventually going to get his hands on Garcia. He might even have to pull guard, but I do give Hooper the advantage on the mat, and I do think he's going to make Garcia work there. He might be able to pull off a submission later in the fight if Garcia does start to slow down. So I'm going to go with Hooper here. I think he's going to somehow get this fight to the ground and get his grappling going. So I'm going to go with Hooper. Hooper by round 3 submission. And next up, we have Andrei Arlovski versus Marcos Rogério de Lima. And de Lima's the minus 180 favorite. Arlovski's the plus 155 underdog. And I guess we'll start with Arlovski first, who is having a bit of a career resurgence, right? 4-fight win streak. Been looking good, doing a decent job of dictating the pace, controlling exchanges, and just, out hustling these lower level guys and being able to come out ahead in these exchanges. Just solid veteran performances by Arlovski. I like how his game has evolved and adapted in the twilight of his career. But the fact of the matter is, I feel like he is going up against some pretty low level guys. These guys that do match up to him, pretty well stylistically, right? Guys like, Jake Collier, Jared Vanderaa, Chase Sherman, Carlos Felipe, just these lower level heavyweights who I don't think are massive power threats, guys who are kind of content to play into Arlovski's game. That said, though, being able to rattle off 4 fights in a row at this stage in his career, I think is still quite impressive for Arlovski, but I do think he's got a somewhat tough test ahead of him in de Lima, right? I know de Lima does get memed a bit. The guy is a notorious gasser. He gets finished a lot, but for de Lima, he is someone who does start very hot, right? He is actually kind of dangerous in that first round. He throws with violent intent early. He's got some very nasty leg kicks. He's looking to kind of blitz you and just throw hammers at you. But of course, that does leave him kind of vulnerable later in fights, right? Especially with how bad his cardio already is. The pace he pushes does not help that whatsoever. Historically, he's kind of fallen apart later in fights. Round 2, round 3, sometimes even round 1. The cardio dump is very real for this guy. We did see him pace him a little bit more against Ivanov in his most recent fight, but it was just too diminished to really do much. That said, though, it wasn't a great performance by either guy, if I'm being honest. But the issue that I'm kind of having with Arlovski in this matchup is he's going up against a guy who is going to go in there and maybe look to swarm him early. And I do feel like that's probably de Lima's best chance of victory here. I don't think that Lima is gonna, outpoint Arlovski, especially with, how his cardio's looking, even when he paces himself. So I do think that Lima is probably going to have to start off aggressively here to maximize his win condition. And I think Lima does have pretty underrated fight IQ, or rather game planning, I should say. His approach to fights do kind of change a bit depending on his opponent. Like, I do feel that Lima is someone who will go into a fight looking to maximize the win condition, right? Because you look at his fight against Maurice Green, he goes in there and basically just puts on a grappling clinic, right? Historically, Lima is someone who starts off hot, but he knew that Green had absolutely no ground game, no takedown defense, and is able to just lay on top of Green for 3 rounds. Against Rothwell, an aging fighter who has, started to show some cracks in the chin. Lima goes out and does what he usually does, just swarms him and gets an early finish. And then against Ivanov, we saw that Lima adapt a much different, fight style than he usually does. Goes in there and fights a slightly slower pace than he usually does. He probably respected the durability of Ivanov. He respected the cardio of Ivanov, and instead of just going in there looking to take his head off early, he tries to pace himself out. Obviously didn't really work for him, but it was still a very close fight against an Ivanov who, quite frankly, looked like dog shit that fight, but still, it shows that Lima is willing to switch up the game plan depending on the opponent. And I just feel that is something that's worth noting here, because I do feel that he's going to come in here and probably look to test the chin of Arlovski early. And Arlovski, he is on a nice little streak of just not getting starched in there. But let's not forget, Arlovski, he's 43 years old. He has had a history of getting knocked out by pretty heavy hitters, I'll admit. But I do think that someone like Lima probably does have the power to hurt and maybe even knock out someone like Arlovski, a 43-year-old Arlovski. Because, taking a look back at the last few fights that Arlovski's had, guys like Collier, Vanderaa, Felipe, Sherman, and even Boser to an extent, I just don't think are massive power threats. I do think that Lima is. Of course, you do have the cardio to worry about, how he's going to look in that second and third round if he isn't able to get Arlovski out of there. But I do think that Lima's got the potential to get that round 1 knockout here. And even if he doesn't, I feel like he could still compromise Arlovski enough early that maybe Arlovski's not able to fully recover going into that second or third round, and we still see Lima be able to edge another round, even if he is tired. Because at the end of the day, Arlovski, he is 43 years old, and even if he does get the fight he wants, fighting at his own pace, he does still slow down as well. Like, I don't think Arlovski's some cardio machine either, right? Like, against Felipe, against Vanderaa and Collier, he's significantly slowed down later in the fight, and he's getting the fight he wants in those matchups. But against Lima, I feel like he's going to be under a lot more pressure. He's going to be taking a lot heavier shots in there. And so, who knows how Arlovski's cardio is going to hold up in this sort of dogfight potentially. So I've got to go with Lima in the spot. I think he's going to find the chin of Arlovski early and put him out. So give me Lima by round 1 knockout. And moving along to the next fight, we have Josh Fremd versus Tresean Gore, and Fremd's the -190 favorite. Gore is the +165 underdog, and we'll start with him first, right? So Gore, a guy who looked pretty good on the Ultimate Fighter, which is kind of funny in hindsight. I think a lot of people were kind of high on this guy, me included. I thought he'd be able to make a bit of a splash at the UFC level, but coming in with a 3-0 record, he just showed that he really needed a lot more seasoning to his game. Needs to polish up a lot of things, actually. And the issue with coming in 3-0, at the UFC level is that, you drop a couple of fights and all of a sudden you're on the brink of being a 500 fighter, just 2 fights into your UFC career, which is honestly kind of embarrassing. A 3-2 record is something you see maybe in the women's flyweight division. That's something you see on the Bellator prelims. So the pressure's going to be on Gore here to perform. I think he's going to have to win, but not just win, but win pretty decisively. You don't want to be 4-2 at the UFC level or overall, I should say, 1-2 at the UFC level, with your only win being a very hairy split decision or something. So I think he's going to have to put on a solid performance there and potentially, get a knockout here to really get his career back on track. But that'll have to start with Gore just being a bit more aggressive on the feet, right? Because I do think he's got the tools to succeed. He's a pretty heavy hitter. The issue is he's just kind of low volume. He's kind of had a tendency of letting fights slip away. And the frustrating thing is he's actually shown flashes in there. He's shown some good moments in there. He's hurt opponents. He's landed some good shots. It's just he doesn't have the aggression or the killer instinct to really follow up on him, which I think can be remedied with a little more experience in cage time. But as it stands now, I don't know if it's quite enough, because he is going up against a decent fighter in Fremd, who is a pretty good range striker. I don't think he's anything special, but he does appear to be able to get the job done at the regional level at least. He's got decent footwork. He does a good job of pressuring opponents, fighting on the outside, and kind of just picking at him, with his jab, with his kicks. He's got decent volume and pressure. He's shown that, he's got that dog in him. He's someone who is going to look for a scrap. He's going to continue to come at you. He's got some wrestling upside as well. It's not a massive part of his game, but I do like that it's something he can mix in. The big concern, though, with Fremd is maybe the durability. He has been knocked out. He did get knocked out by Gregory Rodriguez, which G-Rod's a legit top 10, top 15 guy now. So I don't know if you could really take too much from that, but he has been dropped and rocked by other regional guys as well. Fremd has been able to recover, though. He's been able to come back from some of these situations and still be able to put it on opponents. So, I don't think he's chinny by any means. But it is a little concerning here because Gore does have a bit of power in his hands. The only issue is he just doesn't have any sort of, finishing instinct whatsoever. He doesn't have that sort of aggression to get after it. And that's if he lets his hands go, right? Because Gore has had, a tendency to just sit and wait for the perfect shot. And even when he does connect, he's not jumping on opponents. So I do have a lot more concerns on the Gore side than I do on the Fremd side. Even if Gore is able to clip and hurt Fremd, I don't know if he's got, that killer instinct. And Fremd has shown, pretty good recoverability. So I am definitely on the Fremd side here. I do like that his game is a little more refined. He's got a much more clear process to his game. He's a little more well-rounded. You know what Fremd is going to look to do in there generally, and he is pretty reliable to fight the way he does, right? Just pressure opponents, pick them apart, mix in some of the wrestling. Whereas with Gore, I feel like he's still struggling to kind of find his identity in there. I feel like he's showing up and he's looking for a big shot in there or something. I don't know if there's a ton of layers to his game yet. I don't know if there's really just any sort of process to it. So I do have some questions there. I do feel like Gore overall is still very green as well. He's making a lot of mistakes. And, despite Fremd's potential chin concerns, I'm not sold on Gore's chin either. He got knocked out twice in his last fight against Brundage, right? He got dropped and then ground and pounded. Basically was just ping-ponging in and out of consciousness as his head was bouncing off the canvas. And, to piggyback off of that a little bit, the sequence leading up to the knockdown kind of showed how green Gore was, right? He's thrown a lot of naked leg kicks. And in the last one that he threw, he was completely off balance. His hands were down. And Brundage just saw that and lined one up down the middle, sat him down, and basically just pounded him out. So I do feel that Gore, maybe he's got some tools to succeed at the UFC level. He just hasn't really put it all together. He's got that power, but he hasn't really been able to really fully utilize it. He hasn't been able to really maximize just his win condition in there. And for those reasons, I can't get to Gore here. I feel like he just needs a lot more. He needs a lot more seasoning. I think the potential is there. He just needs more fights under his belt. So I'm going to go with Fremd to win this. I think that he's probably going to be able to do what he usually does, just stay on the outside, look to out-volume Gore, potentially mix in a little bit of the wrestling. But I do think Fremd gets it done here. I think Fremd gets it done by decision. Next up, we have Waldo Cortes-Acosta versus Jared Vanderaa. Acosta's the minus 200 favorite. Vanderaa is the plus 170 underdog. And here we have our just patented low-level heavyweight bout. And I'll just kick it off with Vanderaa here, who, like I was saying, pretty low level, pretty one-dimensional as well. It's pretty surprising he's kind of hung around for this long. I do believe he's probably on the verge of getting cut here, especially if he loses. But he does have, I think, a pretty fun style. I don't think he's really been in too many boring fights. He's someone who's going to come forward and throw volume. But the issue with Vanderaa is he's just got way too many holes in his game. I think he's way too hittable. I think his ground game is extremely subpar. He's got very little wrestling and grappling upside, at least at the UFC level. He did show a little bit of it on the regionals, but has not gone to it whatsoever, since coming to the UFC. His wins have been over some pretty low-level guys. His usual path to victory is just to come in here and outstrike you and outwork you, which is, pretty hard to do when you're kind of hittable and pretty slow yourself. So I do think that Vanderaa overall is a pretty limited fighter, and his losses, I think, are kind of all over the place. He's lost to some good guys, but he's also got losses to guys like Sherman and getting finished in the third round the way he did, just salt to the wound. So not a great look in particular for Vanderaa. And it seems pretty apparent where his ceiling is at the UFC level. But he is going up against a UFC newcomer in Waldo Cortes-Acosta, who does seem to have some power in his hands, right? The guy's a legit heavyweight. I think he's decently athletic. The striking does seem solid enough, but there are some red flags on the Acosta side. Obviously, he's got a lot of early finishes against some somewhat low-level guys. He has faced some names in there, so it's not like he's, beating complete bums in there, but a lot of early finishes, so you do have to wonder how he's looking later in fights. He is someone who I don't think has a ton of volume either. It does seem like he's a bit reliant on some of these big moments, and I do feel like some of his opponents are a bit up there in age, or they're a bit smaller in stature too, so he's getting somewhat favorable matchups. That said, he is handling them like he's supposed to, but I was expecting a little more from Acosta. I saw the line, around like minus 200, and I was expecting him to be a little better than what I saw on tape. So I think maybe the bookmakers just might not be respecting the game of Vanderaa too much, which I kind of understand. I don't think Vanderaa is that good of a fighter, but, he does have that UFC experience. I don't think he's completely lost on the feet here. I do think that there is a path for Vanderaa in terms of just striking, being the more active fighter. He's shown he could maintain that sort of output over the course of 3 rounds. But the big issue that I am having on the Vanderaa side, it's a couple things actually. One, I mentioned before, he is very hittable. The guy is taking a ton of damage in all of his fights. He's getting lit up by pretty much all of his opponents. Which brings me to my second point is, Vandera's just taken a ton of damage throughout his UFC career. He's taken a lot of damage on the regionals as well. Just taking a look at his UFC career, though, in the Contender Series, he did get that early finish over Hunsucker, but, prior to that, Hunsucker was actually landing some bombs on Vanderaa against Spivak. Spivak was, just taking him down and smashing him with the ground and pound. 2 solid rounds of that against Tafa. He did win that fight, but, he was taking damage as well. It was a 3-round war against Romanov. Similar story to the Spivak situation, just got taken down and pounded out. Against Arlovski, not too much damage to there, but, he was getting touched up by Arlovski, was getting touched up by Sherman, and eventually did get finished. So I guess the big concern here is I do feel like the durability of Vanderaa is trending downwards. I wouldn't say he's a chinny guy, but with just the amount of damage he's taken and just how quickly he's turning over fight to fight, does leave me concerned with how much damage he could continue to take, right? Because since coming to the UFC, I think he's fought like 6 or 7 times in the past 2.5 years, which is a pretty quick turnaround for someone taking as much damage as he is. And Cortes-Acosta is someone that can crack, someone that will kind of pressure you a bit and look to put hands on you. So I don't know if the durability of Vanderaa is going to hold up. I honestly really did not like what I saw from him in the Sherman fight. I did pick Sherman to win that fight, but seeing Vanderaa kind of just get folded in that third round. Again, Chase Sherman, just not a good look. I just think that it's a pretty bad sign for him in terms of just the durability. And, I don't know if he's going to be able to take too many big shots from someone like Cortes-Acosta. So I'm going to go with Cortes-Acosta here. The money line obviously is a bit steep for someone coming in making his UFC debut. And despite what you want to say about Vanderaa, if he's not getting finished in there, he's actually putting on decent enough performances, right? In the Sherman fight, if he doesn't get finished late in that fight, he probably wins 2-1. Against Arlovski, he doesn't get finished there and puts on a very competitive fight. Does go the distance against Tafa and wins a decision there. So, if he's not getting taken down and pounded out or getting finished late in the fight, he does put on pretty, competitive performances. So if he doesn't get finished here by Acosta, I do think that Vanderaa, may be live for a decision here, but I got to go with Acosta here. I think the writing's potentially on the wall with Vanderaa. I think that he could definitely get cracked in this fight. So I'm going to go with Acosta to win by round 1 knockout. I don't hate anyone taking a shot on Vanderaa, honestly, because the guy is going to come in and scrap, and he is going to test Acosta if, Acosta doesn't get that early finish. So I'm going to go with Acosta here. I think he's going to touch the chin of Vanderaa early and put it on him. So I'm going to go with Acosta by round 1 knockout. And next up, we have Dustin Jacoby versus Khalil Rountree. And Jacoby's the minus 155 favorite. Rountree's the plus 135 underdog. We'll start with Jacoby. Definitely the more experienced and seasoned kickboxer. Very technical in there with the striking. Very good at distance. Does a good job of striking at distance. Good jab, 1-2. Decent combination striking overall. Pretty solid kicking game from him. Someone who will mix it up on all 3 levels. He can do a decent job fighting out of southpaw as well. So he could fight in both stances. I think Jacoby's a solid fighter, man. He's on a nice little win streak here. Basically undefeated since coming back to the UFC. And that does leave me a little confused as to why Jacoby took this fight, because I do believe Jacoby is ranked. I believe he is a top 15 guy after beating Yong. And now I believe he's fighting down the rankings against an unranked guy in Rountree who is pretty dangerous himself and, doesn't bring a lot of name value to the table here. So I don't want to put too much stock into these narratives, but I'll probably have to look into how this fight got made, who asked for this matchup and whatnot, because I do feel that this could potentially be a letdown spot for Jacoby, because I do think he's a very solid technical fighter, but against someone like Rountree, who does, bring that power and explosiveness to the table, I feel like it could shake things up a bit. But Rountree, he is obviously just an absolute tank on the feet. But the thing with Rountree is, he's had some pretty inconsistent performances. He's very good. He's very scary, very dangerous when he's on his game, when he's moving forward, and he's thrown with confidence. But he has had some pretty questionable performances as well. He's got a number of knockout losses on his record. He did drop the ball against Marcin Prachnio, who is really not a good fighter in my opinion. And Rountree looked pretty flat in that performance. So Rountree, he does look good when he's on, but he has dropped the ball before. But it does look like maybe he's finally starting to put it all together. It seems. Right, apparently he took a bit of time off and went to Thailand to train his Muay Thai a little while back after getting knocked out. And I feel like sometimes when you're making, big changes to your game like that, it does take a few fights for it to really settle in. The sparring helps and stuff, but you really do need to get those live rounds in. And it seems like now that he's gotten a few fights under his belt since, I guess moving to Thailand, he's maybe gotten a little more comfortable with his game. He's definitely looked a lot better in his last 2 fights. But the thing is, I just don't know if it's quite enough to go up against someone like Jacoby, who does have a lot more kickboxing experience. And it kind of shows on the feet, too. Jacoby definitely seems a lot more technical there, just in terms of the footwork, the distance management. And he's got the experience as well. So I do feel that overall, in terms of just the striking, he's probably maybe a step up from Rountree, but Rountree does have that equalizer in his hands. He's got the forward pressure, the aggression. But I feel like someone like Rountree, I think, can probably be matadored a little bit by someone like Jacoby. I feel like he probably can get finessed to a decision by Jacoby. I think we're going to see a lot of lateral movement from Jacoby. He's going to be working the kicks at distance to stay busy, to manage distance. And I feel like Rountree does struggle a little bit with guys who are maybe a bit bigger than him, longer than him, who can stay on the outside, avoid the big power shots, not brawl with him too much. I just can't get the Pragnio performance out of my mind, and I just feel like Jacoby's a way more polished version of Pragnio, just way slicker on the feet, way more technical, better cardio also. So I got to go with Jacoby in this spot. I see him just being able to finesse Rountree to a decision here. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Jacoby. I think he'll win a decision. But I will say this, man, I just do have a really weird feeling about this fight. Like it's a potential letdown spot here. Obviously not going to let that affect my pick here. But I do have a really weird feeling about this fight. But official pick, I'll go with Jacoby by decision. And in the co-main event, we have Max Griffin versus Tim Means. And Griffin's the minus 185 favorite. Means is the plus 160 underdog. And this is actually a pretty intriguing fight between two veterans. Obviously, Tim Means been around for a little bit longer, but both guys have actually been around the UFC for a little while now. But both guys pretty solid, well-rounded fighters. Pretty good boxing on both sides. Both guys are capable wrestlers. I do actually think that Means is going to be the better wrestler in this matchup here. But, both guys are very solid there. Both guys have been around. They face some pretty good guys. They've both kind of floated around that, top 20, top 25 spot. They're able to go in there and make pretty easy work of guys who aren't, quite UFC caliber, but will struggle a bit against guys who are a bit on the come up, maybe top 15, top 20 sort of guys. But ultimately, I do think both guys are pretty solid fighters with pretty solid, well-rounded skill sets. Obviously, Tim Means will have a little more experience, but he will have a bit more wear and tear. The guy has been dinged on a number of occasions. He's been club and subbed. He's been knocked out. He does get buzzed a lot easier than he did, early in his career. Obviously, he's 38 years old. Max Griffin, not a spring chicken himself at 36. But I do think that he's definitely got far less wear and tear compared to someone like Tim Means. That said, though, I don't think Tim Means has looked horrendous or anything. He's been kind of hurt by some pretty heavy hitters, right? Guys like, Holland and maybe even D-Rod. I don't think D-Rod's like a big power threat or anything, but the guy does have really good technical boxing, and if he is able to land clean, he could put you in some pretty bad spots. But overall, I feel like Tim Means has actually looked decent lately. He hasn't looked completely washed or anything. Obviously, he still can get hurt standing. I think it's much easier to hurt him nowadays than it is before, but it's not like he's just a completely shot fighter or anything, or that he's completely chinny, right? He still ate some pretty big shots from Holland. Did eventually get a club and sub, but it wasn't like he was just out cold, staring at the ceiling or anything. And at the end of the day, I do feel like a lot of the guys that are finishing Means are pretty potent finishers, or capable finishers, I should say. Whereas with Griffin, I feel like he's a bit more of a decisionator. He has gotten some knockdowns, but I don't think he's a massive power threat. He did get that knockdown against Magny, but I feel like that's more so him catching Magny coming in with something, because Magny was able to pop back up pretty quickly from that and was even able to win the final 2 rounds after getting dropped in the first. But beyond that, Griffin hasn't actually shown I think a ton of power in his hands. I know he did knock Song Kanan out, but Song Kanan's a complete bum in my opinion. And Griffin did get a finish over Brahimaj as well, but that guy, in my opinion, is also a bum. And I believe that stoppage was more so from Brahimaj's air damn near falling off, right? Because he was eating some nasty elbows in the clinch. So that's what happened there. Not so much Griffin showing massive power or anything. So I'm not entirely convinced that Griffin's going to be able to find the button here on Means. And if that's not happening, I don't see how Means is a plus 150 underdog here. I feel like this should be closer to a 50-50 fight. I think that Means is competitive everywhere. I think he's a capable wrestler as well, and we have seen Means go to the wrestling lately. Griffin, in my opinion, does struggle a bit when guys are able to push that sort of wrestling pace on him. Not even wrestling pace. I think if you're able to mix it in against Griffin, he will actually slow down a bit. His striking cardio is on point, but, we saw in his fight against Magny was slowing down, especially once Magny started pushing the wrestling, the grappling, and the clinch work. Happened against Oliveira and even Morono as well. I think there are actually some other fights where he does get wrestled or grappled, and we do see that he slows down a bit. He struggles a bit in these fights, and I feel like a veteran in Tim Means is going to be able to do that. Obviously, I don't expect Means to come out here and shoot like 4 or 5 takedowns and rack up, 7-8 minutes of control time, but I do expect Means to be able to mix it in, somewhat effectively, right? Because I do think Means is competitive enough on the feet that he doesn't have to shoot like desperation takedowns, but I do feel that in a competitive striking affair, a takedown from Means could potentially seal the round. Obviously, Griffin is live for the takedowns himself. But for those reasons, I feel like it should be much closer to a 50-50 fight than where it is lying now. So, official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Tim Means. I think he's going to be able to pull off the upset here. As long as he doesn't get hurt really badly at any point, I feel like he can make this a very, very competitive fight. And honestly, I think if he doesn't get dinged here, I feel like he could actually have a good shot of winning this fight as well. So I'm going to go with Tim Means to win by decision. And in the main event, we have Arnold Allen versus Calvin Kattar. And this fight is a pick'em right now. I know some books have Kattar as the slight favorite. You can get Arnold Allen at like plus 100 or so. But for the most part, it does look like this is a pick'em fight. And rightfully so, in my opinion. I think this is going to be a very competitive, very high-level boxing affair. Two guys who I think are kind of similar in their striking, their boxing. I think aesthetically they look very similar. They both have really good fundamentals. Just the way they, I guess, kind of strike, how they move in there, how they hold their hands, like the extension that they have. Very similar in those regards, in my opinion. And I'd go as far as to say I think their approach to fights are kind of similar also, right? I'd say Allen may be a bit more defensive on the feet. A little more defense-oriented. The output, obviously, is not going to be there as much compared to Kattar. But I do feel that Allen's going to be the slightly more well-rounded fighter. Both guys have shown some wrestling upside, but Allen, in my opinion, is a bit more consistent with it. He implements it at a far higher clip than Kattar, I'd say. But like I was saying before, Allen does struggle a bit being a kind of low volume. He's someone who is content sometimes to just sit at distance, pump out the jab, and mix in the wrestling occasionally to win rounds. He is undefeated at the UFC level, only one professional loss overall. But up until the Yusuf fight, I feel like he hasn't had the most impressive UFC run. But at the end of the day, he is getting wins, and I did feel like that fight against Yusuf and even his fight against Hooker, I think, showed me a lot about Allen. I do think that Allen is definitely a contender in this division. I think he did need those signature wins to really make some waves and really get the recognition that I think he does deserve. But yeah, he's going up against Kattar, who is a pretty good boxer himself, right? Does do a good job fighting behind the jab as well. Very good combination striking, good counters. The guy's got pretty good footwork and distance management, good output and pace. He does roll with shots pretty well. He does shell up pretty well also. That said, though, I feel like Kattar can get a little flustered in there sometimes against guys who have, I'd say, good volume and pressure and pace. He can end up, being a little low volume. He can get just overwhelmed in there, end up shelling up and kind of letting opponents tee off on him a little bit. Against guys with, big power, he could be a little low volume, be a little tentative in exchanges. Guys with, good kicks and distance management could give Kattar some troubles as well. Kattar really likes to operate in that boxing range, and against guys who are able to stay on the outside and mitigate those exchanges, he'll struggle a bit. I feel like overall there may be more holes in Kattar's game that could be exploited, but it is because he's fighting higher level guys, right? It's these high level guys that are finding these holes, and I don't know if Allen is necessarily that guy. So it is a tough fight for me to call on a number of levels. One, I've just been struggling a bit with Kattar. So, I'll be honest here. Since the Holloway fight, I haven't really been able to get Kattar fight correct. I actually picked him against Holloway. And then I pivoted against Chikadze. I took Chikadze over him. Obviously, that didn't pan out. And then I picked Kattar over Emmett. And obviously, that didn't work out. So you got to take my pick here with a grain of salt, because I've been wrong about Kattar in his last 3 fights. But I do think this is going to be a very competitive fight. I think the line is more or less correct here. Just a lot of variables on both sides, a lot of unknowns. With Allen, this is a decent step up in competition. He has fought some pretty high-level guys. I'd say, he did beat Dan Hooker, who I don't know if you could put too much into that. Dan Hooker was coming down a weight class. He did get finished pretty early, but prior to that, Allen did have a pretty solid win against Yusuf. And Yusuf, in my opinion, is a legit top 10 guy. So yeah, I do think Allen is on this level. Kattar obviously on this level as well, but Allen hasn't had that 5-round experience before, whereas Kattar has. I think overall, you got to favor the level of competition. The guys that Kattar has gone up against, he's in his last 3 fights, has gone up against guys like Emmett and Chikadze and Holloway. Obviously got blown out pretty bad in the Holloway fight, but Holloway, as we all know, second best fighter in the division. And then he goes on to blow out another top 15 guy in Chikadze. Solid performance there. And then loses a very close striking affair with Emmett, who is a top 10 guy. So, Kattar definitely a bit more proven at this point, but I'd say that is a bit of a double-edged sword, because with all that experience and all that cage time, it does come with the wear and tear, right? Obviously, he took a ton of damage against Holloway, but he took a ton of damage against Chikadze also. He did win that fight pretty dominantly, but early in that fight, he was eating some nasty shots, and even throughout, Chikadze was sprinkling some pretty big shots in there. Emmett, obviously a big hitter. So, yeah, you do have the experience of fighting with these higher level guys, but you also, rack up that wear and tear. And I guess the question is, is Allen the guy to really be able to take advantage of it? I'm not too sure, because Allen, a bit of a decisionator, honestly, and I know he's coming off of that knockout win over Hooker, but I feel like that might just be a bit of a function of Hooker coming down a weight class, and Hooker also, someone who's taken a ton of damage himself. But beyond that, Allen's been just a pretty big decisionator at the UFC level, and I feel like that is something he's kind of been criticized for, right? Not really putting stamps in fights, but I think it just shows you the fight IQ of Allen. I think he has a good idea of where he stands in fights, and he knows what he needs to do to win these rounds. And at the end of the day, he is winning these fights, and that's really all that matters. You can poke holes in someone's game all you want, but he's 18-1. He finds a way to win, and that's something that I feel like does deserve putting a little bit of stock into. And I guess that brings me to my next point is, I do feel like between the two, Allen's the one that's maybe a little more adaptable in fight. Because like I was saying before with Kattar, he can get a little flustered in there. Like if things aren't really going his way, he doesn't have a way to really pivot out of fights. He's going to fight the way he does, regardless of the opponent. Like, I guess what I mean by that is, you look at the Holloway fight, he's getting completely overwhelmed in there and doesn't really have any sort of answer to it. Doesn't make any sort of adjustments, doesn't really try to get the respect of Holloway or try to slow him down at all or get anything back from him. He ends up just getting completely out-volumed for 5 rounds. And then in the Emmett fight, we saw that the power of Emmett really was getting to Kattar, which I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, I guess, real quick. I think between rounds we see, or we hear Kattar, he tells his corner that Emmett's loading up on his shots. Obviously, he doesn't explicitly say it, but I think if you read between the lines here, it seems like maybe the power of Emmett's kind of getting to Kattar a bit, and Kattar isn't able to completely open up his game like he typically is. And I feel when things start to go off the rails a little bit for Kattar, he doesn't really have a plan B or really anything to fall back on. Just continue fighting the way he typically does. Like even going back to the Moicano fight, he's getting his leg completely chewed up in there. Doesn't really have any sort of answer or response to it, and just loses a very clear decision there. Whereas on the other side with Allen, I feel like he does make these small in-fight adjustments that have kind of swung fights in his favor. I guess what I mean by that is looking at the Yusuf fight. Yusuf starts that fight pretty strong, and it looks like he might start to run away with the round. He's putting it on Allen early, but Allen, I think he recognizes this, decides to start sitting down on a few shots heavy and really gets the respect of Yusuf, knocks him down actually, and is able to get on top of him. Allen realizes that his usual game isn't gonna work out here, right? He can't just stay on the outside and look to pot shot someone like Yusuf. Yusuf, a bit of a bully in there, someone who's gonna get in your face, spam those leg kicks, throw heavy at you. And I think Allen realized, his usual game plan is not really going to work here. You're going to have to make someone like Yusuf respect your power. Allen, we see him sit down hard on some shots. We see him mix in the wrestling and kind of slow down the pace and the pressure that Yusuf is bringing. And then in the Hooker fight, Hooker coming down a weight class, absolutely massive for the division. The power supposedly still there. He's able to put hands on Allen early, and Allen, he does his usual thing. He's backing up, but he feels some of the power of Hooker, and he realizes you can't just let this guy strike you with impunity. Decides he's gonna have to turn the tables a little bit. Starts putting it on Hooker, hurts him bad, and just jumps on him. So obviously you don't want to take too much away from these performances, but I do feel Allen's got a pretty underrated fight IQ. I think he has a pretty good understanding of, I guess, the flow of a fight when you need to start pulling ahead, when you might be down and you need to maybe fight your way back. So I just feel like he may have a better grasp of, I guess, that part of the game. Whereas with Kattar, I feel like he's maybe a little more rigid in there. Because skill for skill, I think both guys are very high-level boxers, but it does seem like Allen's maybe a little more fluid with his approach, combined with the fact that Allen has shown, he's a very willing wrestler in there as well. I think adds a few extra layers to his game in the octagon, that is. So for that reason, I do actually kind of edge Allen. But on top of that, I just think that Allen is on a bit of a come up. He's streaking right now. Obviously, the guy's got a pretty clean record here. But yeah, he's beating guys like Yusuf and Hooker. So he's streaking for sure. Whereas with Kattar, he is on a bit of a rough patch. The trajectory is just completely different directions right now. Allen, on the come up, 28 years old, going to be entering the prime of his career. Whereas with Kattar, probably still in his prime, but more towards the end of it. Title aspirations are probably out of the picture at this point. A dominant loss against the number 2 guy in the division. Just coming off of another loss against another top 10 guy. It's going to be hard to go on that second run, so to speak. And so you just have to wonder how Kattar is handling all this. Whereas with Allen, he is on the come up here. So a bit of a narrative heavy breakdown, but I do feel that from a stylistic standpoint, we have two very evenly matched fighters. And in those cases, I kind of tend to look into the narrative a little more heavy, but I do think Allen can win a pretty competitive decision here. I know people are going to say, Allen, very low volume, but you got to look at the Kattar side here. Kattar has been able to land, north of 130 strikes over the course of 5 rounds. Not looking at the Holloway fight, though. Kattar also does take, decent amount of damage. In both of those fights, he ended up taking over 100 significant strikes. So, I don't have any, concerns with Allen not being able to land on Kattar. I think both guys are going to throw down in there. I think both are going to land shots. Both are going to eat shots. But between the two, I got to favor maybe the youth of Allen. I think he's the more well-rounded fighter as well. I think he's got the wrestling upside. Kattar historically, very good takedown defense, but it's been against really not that many grapplers. I think he's actually really only fought strikers in most of his UFC career, and these aren't really even strikers that are well-rounded guys. They're pretty much out-and-out strikers, whereas with Allen, he is pretty consistently hit takedowns in his fights, and I feel like in a fight where the striking should be competitive, it'll come down to who's able to hit a few takedowns and maybe rack up a little bit of control time. So I'm going to go with Arnold Allen in this spot. I'm going to go with Allen to win by decision. And that'll do it for the breakdowns. So we'll get right into the recap for the previous event, UFC 280. Pretty fun card. I don't know if it necessarily lived up to the hype, but still a very enjoyable card overall. Had some pretty fun fights, some fun finishes, and some crazy decisions, which I'll talk about in just a sec. But overall, I barely came out even on this card. Really it came down to the Yong fight. But let's get right into the recaps. So kicking off the card, Karol Rosa versus Lena Landsberg. Wasn't able to watch this fight. Didn't set an alarm and ended up waking up halfway through the Makhachev fight. But apparently there was a hairy situation early for Rosa, but she was able to win. I did end up parlaying Rosa. There were a number of spots on the card where I felt like the favorite probably should win, but wasn't going to play it straight. Ended up putting her in a smallish parlay. Ended up working out there. Muhammad Makhachev, Malcolm Gordon. Didn't really have any sort of action on this fight. I didn't know if there were too many lines that were playable. Makhachev, a massive favorite. I figured he'd go in there and handle business. And I guess that's exactly what he did against a low-level guy. Would actually be kind of interested to see how he fares against higher-level guys with maybe better striking and takedown defense. But the UFC might slow cook him a little bit and give him a few more layups before they give him that big step up. But next up, we had Petrosian versus Dobson. So Petrosian was a first leg of a four-legger that I had. Honestly, not a parlay I was uber confident in, but I just felt, all these guys had a pretty good shot of winning here. But Petrosian looked good in there, obviously. Was able to just kind of outclass Dobson on the feet. Just not enough volume on the Dobson end, but, Petrosian just showing he was a level above. But moving along, Abubakar Nurmagomedov. So here's the second leg of the parlay, Nurmagomedov in there. And I know Abubakar is not the best fighter, but Omar Gadzhiev, in my opinion, is kind of fraudulent. I thought that for him to win this fight, he'd have to really get the wrestling going, and I just don't know if he's going to be able to get 2 rounds of top time on someone like Abubakar. And I felt on the feet Abubakar is significantly the better striker. And that said, I still wasn't that confident in him, which is why I just stuck him in this parlay. Didn't go too hard on it either. But next up, Volkan Oezdemir, Nikita Krylov. And Krylov was the third leg of the parlay. And I believe I had initially picked Oezdemir. But, I just dug into it a little deeper and just wasn't all that confident in Oezdemir. Like, I was watching a number of fights. They had similar opponents. And I would have to say Krylov looked a bit better against, the same opponents. And Krylov, he is kind of known for being a hot starter, but in fights that have gone the distance, he has been able to kind of gut it out. And I feel like Krylov is low-key a bit of a dog in there as well. So, if he's not able to get you out of there early, he has shown he could put together a competent, 3-round, wrestling, grappling performance. We saw it in the Walker fight. We saw it in the Ankalaev fight to an extent. And then even in the Teixeira fight. So, even in fights that do go long for Krylov, he still isn't completely lost in there, right? So I ended up just sticking him in the parlay. Obviously wasn't that confident either, but, this is just one of those fun, big plus money parlays. Obviously, after this fight, I thought I was in the home clear. I thought I had more or less cashed the ticket. I was expecting that last leg to really come through there. I honestly thought that if anyone was going to bust the parlay, it'd either be Krylov or Abubakar. But it is what it is. We move along into the next fight, Makhmud Muradov versus Caio Borralho. He ended up putting a tiny bit on Borralho by submission. I know that Borralho is a bit of a decisionator, but I felt that in this fight, there could have been a potential, just a big gap on the mat, right? Caio Borralho, a very high level black belt, and Muradov, mainly just a striker who I had some doubts as to whether or not his submission defense was going to hold up. And at plus 400 or so, I was willing to take a small shot to see. Obviously, that never materialized. Muradov's grappling definitely a bit better than I expected it to be, right? Because not only was he able to stuff some takedowns, he was actually able to reverse positions on Borralho a few times and even kind of get ahead on some of these exchanges. So definitely underrated the grappling of Muradov in the spot. But moving along, Bilal Muhammad, Sean Brady, a fight that ultimately I didn't have any action on, and kind of glad I didn't. I think I picked Brady initially, but I like the plus money on Bilal. But I was thinking, if I play Bilal, I'd probably play him by decision, just get some juicier odds on that. But ended up just staying away because I thought Brady would be able to get his wrestling and grappling going and just be able to control Belal, but obviously didn't even come close to that happening. Belal just had a fantastic game plan in there, kept it standing, pressured Brady hard in there, really did not even come close to this fight hitting the ground, and was able to do work on the feet, eventually knock him out, which was surprising to me, surprising to maybe a lot of people who took Belal by decision. But I feel like that might say a little more about Brady than it does about Belal. Obviously, Belal, super underrated, very well-rounded fighter, but to get knocked out on the feet by Belal is, a bit concerning, especially if you want to climb the ladder here, because Belal is a solid fighter, but against better fighters who are able to really punish you for that, it's gonna be tough, man. And Brady still very much has to get his grappling going. It seems to have success, and he's still young, so he could be making improvements, but we'll have to see on that. But moving along into the main card, Katlyn Chookagian, Manon Fiorot. I did bet Chookagian here. I did take the over also. And, it was a close fight. Not too upset with the bet. I thought there might have been some value at plus 170-ish or so. Chookagian did win a round, but at the same time, I don't know how likely she is, to win 2 rounds, if they fought 100 times. So I'm not sure if it's a great bet, if I'm being honest. I don't think it's a terrible bet either. But, the over was able to cash, just wasn't able to cash the money line here. Overall, I'm still not really sold on Fiorot. I really don't think that I don't think she's going to be able to compete against against Shevchenko, if I'm being honest, if that's the sort of performance she's putting up against Chookagian. But next up, Dariush versus Gamrot. I'm kicking myself a little bit in this fight. I did pick Dariush to win, and he was a decent-sized underdog, so a little bummed out I didn't take any action on this fight, but it is what it is. Dariush came in, solid performance, right? I mean, the guy is a grizzled veteran, very competitive everywhere. Showed great takedown defense, was able to keep the fight standing and win the striking exchanges. Just a very solid performance by Dariush. But next up, we have Petr Yan, Sean O'Malley, probably the most controversial fight on the card here. Obviously, a lot of people thought that Yan won the fight, and Yan, in fact, was the fourth leg of my parlay. I honestly thought I had it in the bag going into this fight. But obviously, there's going to be a bit of bias, going over this fight. But I did honestly think that Yan won the fight. 1 and 2, I thought Yan took. 1 very close, very competitive on the feet. But I thought what sealed the deal for Yan in that first round was the wrestling, the takedowns, the top control time. Second round, Yan did get hurt, but he was able to drop O'Malley, was able to do some damage in that second round as well. So I thought Yan did enough in the first 2 rounds to win the fight. The third round, I guess you could give O'Malley because he did land that knee or elbow or something that cut Yan open. Definitely did the damage that fight or that round. Yan still was able to get some takedowns later, but I thought the damage and the strikes that O'Malley was landing later in the fight kind of swung the round in favor of him. But I guess what it come down to was that first round, and I did give Yan that first round. A lot of people saying it's a robbery, and I don't necessarily know if I agree with that. I think the first round was maybe close enough you can make an argument for the other side. So for that reason, I wouldn't call it a robbery, but I do think it was a pretty bad decision, though. Regardless, O'Malley definitely was the side there. It's a shout out to anyone that was on him. Shout out to anyone that had him by decision. I know that was a pretty popular prop. But yeah, I mean, that was a really fun fight. Did get overshadowed a little bit with poor decision, but still a very crazy back and forth fight. O'Malley definitely showing he's a top guy in the division. I think he did answer a lot of questions and did solidify himself as a top 5 guy in the division, honestly. But moving along into the co-main event, we have Aljamain Sterling, TJ Dillashaw, and I did end up having a bit of action on Sterling. Obviously, very weird fight, very weird circumstances, but I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit here, and I'd like to think that I kind of sniffed it out a little bit. Obviously, I didn't know that, Dillashaw was coming into there with an injury, but I did feel that something was up going into this fight. I don't think anyone could really argue that, Dillashaw, injury aside, would have been, probably the value side, the sharp side, because on paper, you have someone in Dillashaw who should be able to match Sterling wherever the fight went. Someone in Dillashaw who is a championship level fighter, a very high level guy, and being able to get plus 150, plus 160 on him, I thought was really good value. But it looked like the whole public was on Dillashaw. A lot of sharp people I knew was on Dillashaw, and yet the line didn't really move at all. And in fact, it was actually getting wider at a certain point. And I had heard from some people that a lot of books had actually accrued a ton of liability on this fight, and they were taking a ton of Dillashaw action, not a lot of Sterling action, and yet the lines remained the way that they did. It made me believe that perhaps the books knew something that we did not, and so I ended up taking a small position on Sterling. I don't usually bet like this, but this was enough for me to take a small bite here, and it ended up working out. And it made a ton of sense in hindsight, Dillashaw talking about his shoulder popping out during training, him speaking to the ref beforehand. So I'm like 99% sure, this information got leaked and the books kind of had an idea. Regardless, I am a little surprised that this isn't getting really any sort of blowback. Just betting aside, I feel like, Dillashaw came into this fight pretty severely compromised. He knew his shoulder's going to pop out of the socket here. It's been popping out in camp. He's telling the ref to not stop the fight if his shoulder pops out. But, if you really think about it, do you think that Dillashaw really came into this fight thinking he'd win with a bum shoulder, knowing that it's probably going to pop out? Like, I feel that kind of messes with the integrity of the game a little bit here, especially since it would appear he hurt himself back in April. So, he had all this time. It was still an issue going through camp, and yet he decided to go through with this fight. Maybe not the worst thing ever, but does kind of mess with the integrity a bit, if I must say. But lastly, we had the main event between Islam Makhachev and Charles Oliveira. Makhachev, biggest bet of the card for me, the bet that I was probably the most confident in. I just figured he's going to be able to take Oliveira down. He's not going to be afraid of the ground game of Oliveira. And Oliveira, when he's put in bad positions, combined with just the insane pace that he pushes, is prone to wilt in there and look for a way out. I did expect Makhachev to go in there and get the finish a bit later in the fight. I didn't expect him to get that second round finish, but I did think that Makhachev would be able to take Oliveira down and eventually break him. And that's exactly what happened. Made pretty quick work of Oliveira. Honestly, made Oliveira look, pretty low level in there. Little questionable for Oliveira to, I think, pull guard early. I think he was a little too confident in his ability to hunt the submission, but not a good idea to let someone like Makhachev get on top of you for free like that, essentially. So, solid performance by Makhachev. Oliveira still a very dangerous fighter, in my opinion. Definitely not someone you want to count out, but it was just, I think, a pretty bad matchup for him. Makhachev, just a bad matchup for everyone, I guess. But it ended up working out for him. Solid performance. Was hoping he'd defend against another contender. I'm not too sure how I feel about Makhachev versus Volkanovski, but still should be a pretty high level fight. In case anyone's wondering, I am on the Makhachev side if they do fight. I think the size is going to be too big of a factor here. Regardless, it was a fun card, great event. I hope you guys did well on that event. Best of luck on this upcoming event. I hope you guys do well with your bets and picks, and I'll catch you guys next week for UFC Fight Night. I guess it's not Mitchell versus Evloev. I don't know who the main event is, so I'll catch you guys next week for whatever the main fight is.